Hello, I'm Carl French. Now let's be clear about one thing right from the start. This video is about how to produce a best-selling non-fiction book. And I don't just mean a bestseller that just scrapes its way into the best-selling list for a while. I'm talking about a book that sells in tens of thousands of copies. And to do that, you need to go about it in a professional way from the outset. But why should you listen to me? Well, the fact is that the very first book I wrote became such a bestseller. In fact, it sold about 250,000 copies. And then after that, I produced some other books which also were bestsellers. We're talking about tens of thousands of copies. And I've helped other people do the same. Now, it doesn't happen by accident, it happens by design. It can't be guaranteed, but if you don't go about it like a pro, aiming from the outset to create a bestseller, then it's difficult. Yes, you can just write a very nice book very well, get nice reviews, good reviews from your audience, do good promotions, and after time, certainly with lots of good reviews, you may well get that book into the bestseller market, and good luck to you. But that's a hard way to do it. Instead, by planning from the outset to go for a bestseller, you stand much more chance. And in this video, I'm going to take you through the planning process that will enable you to get to the point where you can set about planning the writing of a best-selling book. And stay to the end and you'll see exactly what I mean. Right, so let's get started, should we? Now, a good place to start is the marketplace for the kind of book that you're thinking of writing, the kind of subject matter that you're thinking of writing on, which hopefully is your specialist area, so this should be easier for you than it is for me, say. So you decide on your general subject area that you're thinking of writing on, that you've got the expertise in, and then you start to research it. It's not that difficult because these days you can search on the internet for books in a particular subject area. You don't have to go down to a bookshop and wander around it to find out. So you can do a good research and find out what other books are on sale in your subject area. You want to look for books that already seem to be doing well, which look good in any criteria that you're aware of. So you look for good books. But what you're really trying to look for is a gap in the marketplace. Among all the books that are there that are already selling in your chosen subject area, what's missing? Now, what could be missing varies quite a bit. It could be that there's not a nice, slim, economical book on the subject area. They're all rather big and expensive. That's one possibility. Another possibility could be that they all are pitched at slightly wrong level, and you realize that you need to pitch them slightly differently for a rather different audience. Some publishers specialize in that kind of things. A good example is, the books for dummies. I'm not suggesting you write a book for dummies. I'm saying you look for some kind of gap in the market in terms of audience. Or another possibility, and this is very common, that there are quite a few books out there, but they don't cover certain specific things. There are gaps in what they cover and the way that they cover them. Anyway, I've probably said enough now to set you off, so you go and have a jolly good look at the market and the books that are already there and try to identify where you think there's a gap. Another aspect of looking for a gap is looking for a way that you could do something much better than is already there. You can make big improvement on the books that are currently available. So once you've identified that gap that you can fill with your book on your subject, then you're ready to move to the next step. So what's that? Well, let's see. Now, my next point is that specific beats general. But what does that mean? Well, what I mean is that when writing in this gap in the market, you need to identify what I would call a niche. You need to identify a narrow subject area that's catering for a particular audience with particular needs. Let me give you an example. You might say, well, I know about sales, so I'm going to write a book called How to Sell. Not a good idea. It's far too general. Most people who want to know about how to sell better are interested in a particular marketplace, or they have particular issues that they're trying to resolve when it comes to selling. So you could say, oh, well, I know about how to sell video cameras, so I'll write a book on how to sell video cameras. Well, that's not a very good idea either, is it? Because my guess is that there aren't that many people desperately trying to sell video cameras. Obviously there are some, but you're not likely to be a bestseller with that, are you? So what you really need to do is to identify that something is very specific and is a niche, but for which there are lots of people who are potentially interested. There's a potentially big audience. I sometimes describe that as being a narrow, deep niche. The depth of the niche being a large number of people are actually interested. It's very often the case that the way you tackle a niche is because it's dealing with a particular set of problems that are very common for people who are already interested in that subject area. So that gives you a bit of a clue. So having identified this gap in the market that we want to fill and some aspects of how we might do it, we're now looking for this deep niche, this very specific area that we're going to tackle and is going to be the basis for our book. So now we've got this deep niche, we've got this specific topic, we can move on to the next stage. So what's the next stage in our cunning plan? Now let's start thinking about your reader, the person who's actually going to buy your book and read it. Who is your audience is another way of expressing that, then thinking about all the different kinds of people who might want to read your book. But it really does help to think about the most typical or likely reader that is potentially going to buy your book, and thinking about that individual is usually very enlightening and also very helpful when you're writing, which comes later. So think about who your primary reader is, and once you think you know who your primary reader is, then it really helps if you ask yourself, what result do they want for themselves when they've finished reading my book? What result do they want for themselves? What do they want to be able to do? What do they want to know? What is it they're after? Because if you really get a good understanding of that, then you can let them know that's what you're going to provide them with, but you can also make sure that the book delivers what they're after, and then they'll walk away happy and recommend your book to other people. So who's the reader and what do they want as a result? A secondary question is to ask, who else might be a reader and what might they want as a result? And it's typically the case that you can think of 2 or 3 potential readers, each of whom might have a slightly different result that they want. But don't go beyond that. But with those in mind, you've then got a very good guide as to exactly what this book has to deliver for those readers. And then we can move to the next step. Well, now we're at the point which is often the starting point for some people who haven't really thought about some aspects of writing a bestseller, and that is sorting out the content. But we've already looked, haven't we, at the audience and what result they want from reading your book. So that now needs to drive us as we construct what's going to be the content of your book. So thinking about what result your reader needs leads naturally into identifying the various topics that you need to cover in order to get that result. And what we need to do is to write down brief headings for what those topics are. Now those topics are likely to end up being chapters in your book, but there's a possibility that we might split some up and rearrange and so on. So don't worry about chapters right now. It's just to give you a bit of a look ahead. So writing down the topics that need to be covered in order to get the result that your reader wants, and get that list together. Now if that list starts to look very long, 30 of them or something, then you're probably going down at too detailed a level, and if you've only got 3, then maybe you need to be more detailed. So somewhere between say 5 and 20 is more likely to be right. It does rather depend on the scope of your book, of course. So you write down these topics. Don't worry about the order just yet. The next thing to do is under each topic to start fleshing them out in terms of the series of points that you need to cover. Again, don't start writing the content, but identify what the content needs to be. You might like to write bullet points or very brief sentences, but don't go into very wordy items here. You're really trying to identify a list. So what are the topics that need to be covered within each of these main topics that you've already identified? And again, don't worry too much about sequence, although it will be useful to get them into sequence at some point, so when it's convenient to you. And once you've gone through all the topics and underneath them listed the key things that need to be covered, then take a step back and look at it all. And at that point it probably is sensible to start putting your top level topics into sequence, and this is going to be your chapter sequences. And by looking at that second level, that may well help you identify more clearly what the sequence will be. It may also result in you doing a bit of rejigging as exactly what these topics are. So don't be afraid to produce a second version of this, slightly better reorganized. The other thing that might happen, and it does quite often, is you realize there's sort of stages to what you want to cover, and that often ends up being parts to a book or sections to a book. And if that seems like a sensible way to organize it, well, identify what those sections are called or those parts are called and organize the content under them. But don't feel it's necessary to do that. Only do that if it really seems like a very good idea. Most of the time that's not necessary. So once you've got all these top high-level topics organized and they're looking more and more like your chapter titles, then the thing to do is to go to the next level. Now a lot of people duck this, but don't let yourself do that. Make sure that you go through again and go down to a third level under each of the subtopics and flesh that out with what the specific things are that you need to cover, and work all the way through the full list doing that again. You'll find by doing that you'll probably want to reorganize things again, but it's a darn sight easier reorganizing things at this level than trying to rewrite things later. So it will save you a lot of time, but more importantly at this stage it's getting you to scope the book well and getting down to exactly what you need to cover. So now once you've got to that stage at 3 levels, now stand back again, and this is important, and say to yourself, have I really stuck with the idea of what the reader really wants as a result, or have I got carried away with my own particular interests or ideas? And you may well find that there's something that you've introduced that isn't really needed, that actually might even be something of a red herring, some pet topic of yours. If it doesn't really serve the purpose of letting the reader get the result they want, you need to get rid of it, even if it's a little pet of yours, a little favorite. The other thing is, there may be a topic that you're not so brilliantly interested in or keen on that the reader really needs, and if that's the case, then you need to introduce it and make sure it's there, even if it's not something that you feel particularly enthusiastic about. So there is an element of sort of re-editing even at the top level now, pruning out things that really shouldn't be there and making sure you've included things that are. But when you've done all that, you will have a sequence of chapters and a detailed plan of what's in them, and what's in them should now look like what's really needed for this particular reader or this set of particular readers and what they want as a result. And we've now made a lot of progress. This will take you a while and you may want to have a break and go back to it, but once you've got there, we are well underway with planning what's going to be your bestseller. So what comes next? We now come to a key topic that lots of authors, amateur authors in particular, don't even think about, and it can be fatal. So let's look at it properly. I've lumped a couple of things together, as you can see on the screen. The two things are what's sometimes called the voice of the author, and the other is style. Talk about voice first. There are lots of personal views around this, but in general, people reading books like to get a bit of a feel for the personality that's written what they're reading, and that means that the person, the author, is in some ways expressing their personality, if you like, through the way they're writing, not in an intrusive way that would possibly annoy, but just, you know, you feel like you're hearing from a human being rather than a robot, so to speak. Now, that isn't always the case when it comes to writing, because some publishers, particularly some big publishers, have what are called house styles, which they rigidly impose, and then everything written for them is pretty much of the same style, and it could have been written by almost anyone. But I would say in general that having your own voice and allowing yourself to have a few quirky aspects of how you write and your particular way you like to express yourself is a good thing, as long as you don't go overboard and start doing rather weird or peculiar things. People reviewing it will usually help you with that, and on a sample of what you've written give you some useful feedback, which you should listen to. But the second thing on here is the bigger topic in a way, and that's about style. Now, I think it's fair to say that in general that professional writers are very aware of style, and they adapt the style they're writing in to suit the particular thing that they're writing, whether it's just a simple article or whether it's a whole book. They know how to adapt the style of writing to be appropriate for the particular work, whereas amateur writers often just have one style that they stick to regardless, and often in a very damaging way. Now, ironically, I've found that people who have got very good academic education, high academic standards, are some of the worst at this, because they've written so much very high quality stuff in a particular academic style, they find it almost impossible to write in any other style, even if the academic style they've written is not appropriate for this audience. So I don't know what your particular background is, but whatever it is, whatever you've written most of, you need to be very careful that you don't just start writing the way you write. I mean, there are other traps here as well, that people write a lot of, you know, informal stuff like on social media, need to sort of also think a bit more carefully about being more careful about the way that they're writing style. So when it comes to style, it is very much a case of thinking, well, what does this particular audience want by way of a style that I'm writing in, and then adapting your style for this particular work. Now, it isn't a case of one style fits all. So I mean, if you are, for instance, writing a textbook and there is an academic element to this, or this book is intended for an academic audience, then you need to be mindful of that. And there are key things like often to express objectivity in what's being written, people write in the third person, you know, a this, that or the other was taken and this was done, that kind of third person way of writing, a more detached, more objective way of writing things. But if you're writing to an individual and you're effectively kind of coaching and helping them in doing something, then that can be a bit aloof and it's not quite so engaging. So I would say most of the time for successful best-selling non-fiction, the work tends to be more in the first person, where you address, you know, the reader as you, just rather as I am with this YouTube video, which is obviously a different medium. So that's it. And then, but there are other things to style in terms of trying to make sure that you achieve you know, a higher readability level. So thinking carefully about your choice of vocabulary, your sentence length and things like this, and maybe doing a bit of a practice to get into the particular style that you want to adopt. Also, when it comes to style, a lot of people I've found who've got a very good sense of humour seem to leave it at the door when they start writing non-fiction. There's nothing to stop you introducing what I'd call humour as opposed to jokes. Jokes is something completely different, but humour, you know, seeing the funny side of things and highlighting that, and a bit of irony and so on, can be very, very, very helpful. So there's a lot more to getting it right in terms of style, and if you think, oh, I'm not sure about this, then I would suggest you go off and look a bit more at what you might be able to do by way of style. And one thing in particular, and there are some other videos on our website on this, there are lots of things to do with how you structure a sentence, a chapter. I mean, there's other things about structuring a sentence, but how you structure a chapter. But basically getting your style together. Some people even write their own style guide, and that's not a bad idea actually, because it gets it into your head. So work out your style, and then you really need to take one of the chapters, preferably not the first one because that's often a bit different, and write one chapter in your chosen style, and then edit it, review it, and get some feedback on that till you've got to the point where you've got one chapter for your book written in draft, but in a suitable style. At that point, you really are then ready to start moving forward with writing this best-selling non-fiction book. And there are other things you need to do, but really we're now going beyond planning for that, and so that's where I'm actually going to stop this particular piece. I hope you found it useful. Run back through the stages. If you do this diligently, your chances of writing a bestseller are vastly enhanced, and I wish you every success with that.